Okay. Well, welcome back, everybody. There's just a couple of people still to come. We've turned the air conditioning on just to bring the humidity down. If it gets too cold, let us know. We can turn on the heat. How many of you enjoyed the teachers? Nobody, one or two. Kirsten Holst, Alison's daughter, who lives here, she's a geriatrician and goes to our church here, has got a lifestyle block out in the country. Those peaches come from stock that Hadfield took from the Bay of Islands to Otaki. And they're grown from stones, two different parts of the garden. So if you had a peach, you're right in line for Octavius Hadfield. That's pretty peachy. And there's every chance that you therefore will convert to Anglicanism.
Heresy.
Or as Waramu says, you'll get stoned. On the back of those sheets, it mentions 2 local pilgrimages. Those will not be proceeding. So I'm really sorry about that. There are several. At this stage, they will not be proceeding. We've got personal health issues that will necessitate that we can't lead them, but we've also got obviously Omicron, and there's no way people are going to crowd onto buses. They are stunning pilgrimages, and they will feature in our book. But if you want to, Hadfield's grave is just up the road from Martin, and you can go to Rangiatea and see that, etc. Rory's grave is accessible. All of those places can, but of course it's not the same as having somebody like David Moxon lead you. So that's there, and we will be leading with David Moxon a pilgrimage in the footsteps of Paul from the 7th of March next year for 3 weeks through Greece and Turkey. If anybody is interested, they can contact us, and we'll give you the details. So are there any particular questions that people want to ask at this stage? No? Okay. We look forward to the next session. We've really been challenged and inspired. Thank you so much for all the work you've done over the years that you bring to this. It's greatly appreciated. Thanks, Keith. Over to you.
Nice to be back. I'm just reminded, talking to my friend from the Solomon Islands here too, that in this idea that we need to rethink our context of who we are as a nation, not only looking to the heavens and understanding the wonder of the movements of the stars and the seasons and the times that we're in, and becoming awed by the magnificence of what God has created, but to be aware that perhaps our colonial history misrepresents us. I get very frustrated when I have to find that the options are limited to me signing off as being a European on a passport or a piece of paper or whatever. I'm seeing increasingly that we need to be located where we are, and that is that we are a Pacific island, and our Pacific neighbours are very much part of the rohe in which the wider representation of our country should be engaged. We have protectorates and we have interests and we send missionaries, and we have an increasingly Pacific Island population in Aotearoa. But for me, the thing is we also have a responsibility to deal to our Treaty of Waitangi responsibilities, so that iwi tahi tātou, we two peoples together are able to stand on solid ground, knowing the basis on which we are here. For Pākehā Tauiwi, it is as tangata tiriti, and for Māori, tangata whenua, or mana whenua, or wherever you are. And when you've got that together, then you've got a much more secure understanding about who you are, and then everybody else can feel welcome to be part of that. And besides, those early waka came through the Pacific, from Rarotonga and from Tahiti and places there. So there are golden threads that link us all together as a Pacific Island nation, not a European nation, not an English nation anymore, although some of our roots might be there. And I think we're at a time where we have to re-examine some of our thinking around the systems that we have in place that were suitable for a time, but are no longer suitable for who we are becoming as a people, and certainly becoming more flexible so that we can deal to the issues of the high proportion of our Pacifica and Māori people who are being disadvantaged by the system. So that's my initial rant. And then I should turn this on, and because vibrating, it means that something's happening. So Bible and Treaty, colonial con or a chiefly charter. I like the latter, but we need to deal with the former. So really, I find it interesting, this Waitangi Day in particular, some of the commentary was quite critical of the missionaries again. It was like we've rediscovered our enthusiasm for putting the missionaries down, and they're part of it, particularly Henry Williams, but we'll get to that. But there were some words that were said at the signing of the treaty that I think are important. Hei iwi tahi tātou. Recently, I'm looking this up and I'm seeing it's been changed to ko tahi tātou. And I'm going, hang on a minute, something shifted. Who changed that? And that got challenged last year at Waitangi. Who put the ko in there? Which ko is a singular thing where really tahi, in the way that is interpreted, is more a metaphorical coming together of peoples rather than something that gives people like the Hobson's choice people some leverage to say that Māori are being privileged, or that this, we're all the same, or you're doing all these letterbox drops that actually do far more harm in creating division than they do in understanding the original intent or of this kawanata or this covenant. Now, Hobson said to each of those chiefs, when signing the treaty, hei iwi tahi tātou. And if you look at Galatians 3:26, this is this scripture that talks about you're no more Jew, nor Greek, nor male, nor female, you're all free. But really, there are women in the room today, aren't there? And nobody would deny the fact. And there are men in the room today, and there may be some Jews here, there may be some Greeks here. So it's not being specific, it's being metaphorical, and it's being biblical in its understanding of what togetherness and unity. It's about the spirit of unity. And somebody just reminded me recently, we ought to be really careful about the political spirit. Because there's a spirit there, isn't there? No, I represent this party and that's where all my votes are going to go. Or a religious spirit. No, I'm an Anglican and I always will be till I die. Or I'm a Presbyterian, or I'm a Methodist, or I'm a Quaker. And we create these divisions. And this whole thing is about the breaking down of the divisions between us that we would see. The middle question is not religious spirit or a political spirit, but Holy Spirit. What are you doing, God, in this time? And this is about the spirit of one people together under one baptism and one. This is a different kind of unity. It's not unity how the world would try and describe it on a spreadsheet. This is a spiritual, deeper kind of unity that we're called to that is wonderful. And Hobson got this message clearly from Henry Williams that his greeting to the chiefs would be, we are now one people. But how they understood it was we're in partnership together. We're going to do something great together. This has potential. This is full of what might come. We can see some opportunities. So you can understand the great disappointment that came fairly shortly afterward. Dame Joan Mitch, we too many peoples together make a nation. That's how she understood that to mean. Or Dame Anne Salmon, who's just a wonderful writer and historian. It's a chiefly gift of exchange, this treaty, a shared humanity, reciprocity and respect. So unity and diversity, a covenant. I remember Judge Joe Williams, what a wonderful man to have in such a position in our country at the moment. What is he, the Chief Judge? And now I think, isn't he? The first Māori High Court, Supreme Court Chief Judge kind of person. And I've heard him tell the story of the gospel coming to Aotearoa, and my heart has been warmed because this is how I understood it. I see him as a very reasonable man. But he's a man who was in one of those early reggae bands, for goodness sake, and then he did all this study for the law. But I see him as a reasonable man, a man who's seeking compassion and unity and justice. And when he came to Hastings, before he spoke this, he used this phrase that made me think. He said, we're joined at the hip. We can't get away from each other. There's been so much intermarriage, so we can't ignore what the treaty is promising us. And I thought there's an image there that just captured me. And I thought, if we're joined at the hip, and we don't decide that we're heading in the same direction, and we don't find some accord or some of that unity that was promised through Galatians, and when Hobson spoke it out, without perhaps understanding it, if you're joined at the hip, then if one person wants to go one way and another person wants to go the other way, we're going to keep going round and round in circles, and the only way forward is to go right. Hey, iwi tahi tātou, we're going to do this together. And that's our mystery, that's our challenge, I think, is how do we do this together? How do we listen to each other in a way that allows us to understand the different perspectives and points of view and understandings? I got a friend, Jacob Scott, who's an architect in Hawke's Bay, and he said to me, Keith, the stories don't have to be the same. They don't have to line up. We don't have to have everything, all the dots tied up. He said it's all right to have multiple stories existing side by side, different points of view, and if we can do that, we can make some progress. But we are so often so caught up with saying, oh, this is the way, or that's the way, or this theology, or that understanding of Scripture, that we're still going round and round in circles on some of the issues that really we should have sorted out a long time ago, including our treaty partnership, protection, and participation, which is the modern day understanding that is used in a lot of our treaty settlements and documents that are used within the corporate world. Participation. People want to be involved. Partnership, we can do this together. And protection, please make sure that we don't undermine those things that we agreed are common between us. How can we do this together is the challenge. Joined at the hip, we're on the way. So the Treaty of Waitangi, after ceding governorship or te kawanatanga or sovereignty of their land, Māori would get exclusive and undisturbed possession of those lands, estates, fisheries and forestries as long as they desired. And we have terms like tino rangatiratanga or chieftainship put in there, and the land and asset sales only through the Crown at agreed prices. This is preemption. This is like the end to the Wakefield period of time where private colonisation was intended and dirty deals were done dirt cheap with Māori before there was any arrangement, and the French were on the way. So the treaty was kind of necessary, and Māori had been saying to the British, you need to come and look after these lawless people who are coming in here, these traders and whalers who are misusing our wahine, who are bringing in, barrel loads of rum and whiskey and getting drunk in the streets and brawling, and there's just chaos. So you really need to come and look after your people. So there's multiple calls for the treaty to be established at this time in history, and Māori are mostly for it. And as I said before, there was a whole debate that went on for a whole day before the treaty was signed on the 6th of February 1840. And of course, the Queen promised Māori protection and equal rights and privileges alongside British citizens, which is a really big thing. Equality is being promised here. You'll be like us. The Queen will protect you. And of course, Queen Victoria is the head of the English Church. So there's an assumption here that she represents godly people who have good intentions and are like the missionaries who Māori have come to trust. So this is the treaty, and of course Bishop Pompallier arrives at the last minute and insists that he become part of this process, and fair enough too, because he represents the Catholics who've been here for a couple of years and are establishing themselves, and he's worried that the Anglicans are going to take over. He's worried that this is only going to be the English, the Church of England. So he's saying, hang on a minute, you need to make sure that my people are protected too for their various faiths. So there was hurriedly drawn up an extra clause that was written down by Colenso that said that, all right, the Anglicans and the Catholics and the Methodists and all their various beliefs in one God and Māori faith would be protected. Now, this is called the Phantom Clause because it never actually ended up in the treaty, but it is oral history, and increasingly we're seeing that oral history is an essential part as we look at things. And we're going to need to be reminded of this from time to time, that actually this was part of the agreement. That the Treaty of Waitangi would not have been signed if it hadn't been for the missionaries, and there is a religious and spiritual component to this. This is not just a political document, this is a spiritual document. Māori are spiritual people, and the treaty was signed because of a trust, because of an understanding that had been fostered over 26 years of missionary teaching. So the treaty is for Pākehā too. So Judge Edward Jury, Ngāti Kaupata over at Orangi, which is the Māori name for fielding, where I grew up, he said in his address at Waitangi in 1989, we Māori must not forget that the treaty is not just a Bill of Rights for Māori, it is a Bill of Rights for Pākehā too. It is the treaty that gives Pākehā the right to be here. Without the treaty, there'd be no lawful authority for the Pākehā presence in this part of the South Pacific. We must remember that if we are tangata whenua, the original people, then Pākehā are tangata tiriti, those who belong to the land by the right of the treaty. So I think that helps us to understand that we are engaged, we are involved, and that we are partners in an enterprise that Māori saw us being involved in together. It's not just a Māori thing. In 1839, there's only 2,000 Europeans in the country, and things changed drastically. Estimated about 80,000 Māori. You have to understand that we lost about 20,000 Māori during the Muscat Wars, and maybe 50 to 70% of Māori are Christians. By 1845, things have changed. There are about 12,000 settlers, with more on the way. The shiploads are on the way, and Māori are in rapid decline through disease, alienation from their land, etc. 1842, the colonial office Christians, those ones who were part of the Clapham sect, who set in place the rules and the instructions to Lord Normanby, James Stephen Jr. in particular, they've all gone from the colonial office. So there's nobody there to govern, to watch over, to caretake this kaupapa that was set in motion for the setting up of the Treaty of Waitangi, or to really protect it. Those who are in place now are more inclined to say, well, there's a lot of settlers, there's a lot of ships come there, and we need the land and we need it now. So there's this whole pressure to sell the land. And the New Zealand company has now, because its acquisitions have been challenged, because they purchased before the treaty, and now it was like we need to investigate whether that was legitimate or not. And a lot of it wasn't. So a deal was made with the New Zealand company as we'll pay you £1 or whatever it was for every acre that you acquired. So the government has actually turned the New Zealand company into a land purchasing agency. It's acquired whatever deals were made and now making them kind of legitimate, but still having to deal with all of those tribes around the country who allegedly sold or attempted to. So the negotiations begin again. And the New Zealand company, which has made all of these promises to all of these people back in England, including sneaky investors who bought up a whole lot of land blocks thinking that they were going to make a killing, because the idea was come in, buy the land at the lowest possible price and sell it for the highest price, and Māori could come and live alongside us if they were civilized, and perhaps just a few chiefs to start with. So they had this whole colonial idea in mind of what would happen. So that's now been subverted, but really the government now has responsibility to fulfill some of those deals of all the settlers that were coming out here thinking they were going to get a white picket fence next to the factory that would employ them and all the rest of it. The land hadn't even been worked. Māori weren't happy with any of this. So there's a mess. All these people are coming into this huge mess, and there is a whole lot of difficulty starting to occur And we'll just quickly go over this. The first land protest, top of the South Island, Wairau, 1843, Rangihaita and Te Rauparaha are saying, no, we didn't sell that land. And they told that to Wakefield, but Wakefield persisted. There's some dirty deals being done there, but Wakefield's brother Arthur goes in with the local militia, attempts to try and put handcuffs on Te Rauparaha and Te Rangihaita, and of course it doesn't end well. They burn the surveyors' huts, and in they go. A bullet gets fired, and Te Rangihaita's daughter, I think it is, there's a whole, or wife gets killed, and she's related to Te Rauparaha, and of course all hell breaks loose. And now the government, now the settlers want those guys to be arrested, and there's a whole lot to sort out. So this was the first trigger that said, actually, they weren't listening to what the government was saying. They were still to investigate these sales, and this one went wrong. And then Honi Heki in the far north is going, hang on a minute, you made lots of promises to us. You promised that trading would improve. You promised that the chiefs would be held in high regard, and now you've moved the capital to Auckland. We're losing business. I cut the flagpole out of my own forest. You put the Union Jack there. Where's the flag that was promised for the Declaration of Independence? Honi Heki's sailing up and down the Bay of Islands with an American flag on his waka, saying, because he's been told by the American sailors that you guys, now that you've signed the treaty, you're slaves. You're going to be like what happened to the American Indians. So he's all upset, and he's not getting any feedback from the government. So that's when Honi Heki becomes Honi Heki, and 3 times later the troops are called in, and we've got things beginning to explode out all over the place. The militia's called in, and this is the trigger for the early land wars. Meanwhile, September 1844, Henry Williams is insistent that the Treaty of Waitangi be honoured, and he's embarrassed by what's happening. He's concerned that things aren't happening as he hoped and as he had promised to Māori that they would, because remember, the missionaries, Māori have said the missionaries will sort it out. So he prints 400 copies of the treaty in Māori again, insisting you are not slaves of Queen Victoria. The treaty is like the Magna Carta in England that made sure that the dominating class, the royal class, couldn't rule it over you and take your lands. It secures your lands and rights and privileges. But by 1845, he's still persistent. He says, that's a sacred compact. It's impossible for the Queen or the Governor to admit deceit before the chiefs. He's still defending the Māori cause. He's saying, no, really, trust me, trust the Queen. She'll do the right thing. It will come right. But 1845, missionary advice is totally being ignored. And Honi Heki hears about Earl Grey. Now, he's the Earl Grey back in England is the Minister of Native Affairs and the Minister of War. Goodness me, the guy's holding 2 portfolios, and he's decided that the wastelands, any land that's not being used, we'll just take it, because that's what they did in Ireland. It's actually based on Irish legislation. They're trying to impose that here. And Honi Heki's going, this is crazy, because Māori would move around seasonally, different places, different seasons, different forests, leave an ahi car behind, little fire under the ground somewhere. So if another tribe came through there, they go, oh, actually, these people are coming back, we'd be wrong. Or that was the place where you got the kerere, whoops, juicy birds like chickens, or this is the place where you did your fishing. So Māori were kind of moving around. They had their own ways of, and now we're talking about putting up fences, and now we're talking about somebody owns this. This is a foreign concept. Henry Williams regarded this as the warrant of extermination. He tells the Church Missionary Society he feels betrayed and appalled at the attempted violation of the treaty. He would never again plead the honour and integrity of Her Majesty's government, which appeared to be lost nor never possessed. Oh, when I saw that, that's not in my books. I found that later on. Samuel Carpenter, who's a friend of mine, who's a treaty researcher, really dug into that, and that broke my heart when I saw that. I thought, for goodness sake, this is how he felt. So you can imagine how Māori felt, and he must have known what was coming next. So we did that. So the church missionaries, Henry Williams is a bit of a, a thorn in the side of Governor Grey and the land purchasing agents, because he's standing with Māori and he's trying to advocate for their concerns. But the issue is that there was some correspondence going on between Bishop Selwyn, who'd come in just after the treaty had been signed, and he was a high church bishop and he had his own ideas, and he was told, don't interfere with the missionaries, don't tell them where to go, don't take responsibility for their ordination or whatever. They've got their own relationships that they need to work out. So what did he do when he first came in? He did all of the things that he promised not to do, and that was that he took over the missionary movement. Essentially, he made even some of the early missionaries that had been here for a while, like Colenso, jump through hoops before he could be ordained, and learn several languages. He said to some of the Māori missionaries, well, I can't ordain you unless you learn a bit of Latin and Hebrew and whatever. So for goodness sake, these guys are being really effective, working among Māori, now having to put on the robes and the bells and the smells and do the whole Church of England thing, while Bishop Selwyn, and I'm going to be a bit cruel here, imports all his architecture magazines and designing how he's going to build his next church and his next mission school in his own image. Unfortunately, he did a lot of damage. He later on repented for it, but he was complicit in this thing with Grey, who decided that Henry Williams had got land off Māori under false pretences, and they were responsible in having him sacked. The blood and treasures correspondence that went backwards and forwards from England saw Henry Williams get sacked as head of the Church Missionary Society, which broke his heart. But the fact was, he was actually a thorn on the side of the land grabbers. So what does he do? He builds a church on his own property, employs Māori, provides food for them, and continues to look after them. He was ultimately revered by Māori as a father figure, and they paid for the gravestone. He was eventually reinstated, but not after his heart was broken. So there's a twisted history in here that you hear repeated year after year. It died down for a while, but it came up again this year, and it's based on this woman, Ruth Ross, in the 1970s. She wrote a thesis suggesting that Henry Williams intentionally misinterpreted the Treaty of Waitangi and that he was devious in doing so. But if you really understand Henry and you really understand the character of him and his wife and his kids and how they stood with Māori through so much, you cannot really believe that. There's something dreadfully wrong with that, but that's what the academics do. They pick up on this person's thesis, and of course it's Henry's fault, all of this. But in fact, I think Henry is an amazing man. So really, George Clark produced a pamphlet that tried to give an understanding of how Māori understood the treaty. He said the expressive language used and fully understood by both parties to the treaty was this: that the shadow of land was to be the Queen's sovereignty, and the substance was to remain to the native chiefs, their lands, their tino rangatiratanga or chieftainship over their own tribes. In other words, Māori understood that they would still have governance over their own regions unless some other arrangement was made. That was what the understanding was when Clark reviewed things in 1840. But you have to look at what Hobson did. Hobson created the Protector of Aborigines Office. This was the agency through which the promises of the treaty were to be looked after and Māori issues were to be understood, and to ensure all land sales were lawful and at a fair price. In 1845, Governor George Grey abolished that office and instead created the Commissioner for the Extinguishment of Native Title. Kind of says it all, doesn't it? You know, one to protect and another to extinguish. So out to get the land at all costs. His job was to get land for the settlers who were arriving. So we've got this flagpole I told you about. You know all about that. We all love the graphical image of Heki with the flagpole. In 1858, that was replaced by Mahi Kawati, who was the son of Te Ruki Kawati, who was a friend of Heki's, and part of those wars that went on that were trying to get the attention of the governor. So 500 warriors took a kauri flagpole to replace the one that Heki had cut down up Maiki Hill, and it was called Whakakotahitanga o ngā iwi I rua, the coming together of two peoples. And I see increasingly, although Māori express their frustration, the one thing that they desire is for the two peoples to work together, to be together, to build a future together. And here's Ruki Kawiti creating a flagpole that commemorates this promise, the coming together of two peoples. I think we're still there in some ways, the coming together of two peoples. We need to keep revisiting that. But Governor Gore Brown refused to attend the ceremony. In March 1930, it got severely damaged by a gorse fire. They fixed it up within 3 months. 1932, the government ignored an invitation to the opening of the plaque of the unveiling of it. And on January the 29th, 2018, Governor General Dame Patsy Reedy came with a strong sense of unfinished business to honour and the commemoration and the plaque, and to remind us that this flagpole was the flagpole of the coming together of two peoples. Now, we're moving into volatile times right now because that flagpole's still there, but we couldn't fly the flag this year. The flag couldn't be flown this year. I know COVID has had a great impact on a lot of things like Waitangi, like the route and the celebrations. They didn't happen, but what did happen was pretty sad. The first flagstaff was flown outside Busby's house, and then the United Tribes flag was flown initially when it went up to Maiki Hill. Waitangi 22, this year just gone, the Prime Minister went up there in her van. Her vehicle got blocked off as she was driving down one street. They had to back up the footpath to shrug it off and try and drive somewhere. There was some protests there, but the flagpole, the support wires were cut, the pole was nearly severed, that freedom graffiti was targeted all over it, and that had been the second attempt in several months. It's supposed to be DOC's responsibility to look after it, but it's almost like that was the beginning of some of the things that played out in this country over the past few months. It's just an anger, an underbelly of frustration, of anarchy again, and we have to watch this. We have to watch that we don't get caught up in the sideshow or taking sides on this, but keep asking what's really going on here, what is the real hurt here, who's interfering, who's getting all the news, and what's really happening underneath. And of course, we've still got this major treaty settlement to come. Ngāpuhi in the far north have not settled their treaty issues yet, and they're taking their time over it, not only finding out who's going to be responsible for negotiating that, but they have promised that when they do this will be one of the biggest claims yet to come in the country, that it will be a drama. We do not want an ordinary settlement. We want the nation to know. So we've got this to look forward to, what plays out, how Māori will draw our attention to the issues of concern at the moment. They do not want a sideshow, they want a drama. So there'll be a lot of thinking about what that might look like. All right, let's flip back into history a little bit more. We talked earlier on about Ngāti Awa and others migrating south, led by, from Ngāti Awa, from Taranaki. There was a fellow called Tiriri Te Whangafonga, and he led his people as part of Te Rauparaha's heki to south, and they settled at Waikanai. And this is an important part of the story because this is where Hadfield was welcomed. And this is where that young fella Matahau came from. He went back there to go back to be with his people at Waikanai. He'd been taken captive from Taranaki, so he caught up with his friends, and he brings the Bible, or he brings Te Roka and some pieces from the prayer book and all of that, and he teaches the guys down there. And Hadfield stays at the Waikanai Pa, baptizes Matahau as Hohepa, or Joseph. Whiti Te Rangataki, the son of Te Rere Te Whangafonga, is baptized as Wiremu Kingi, named after King George IV. And 1843, Wiremu Kingi, who's now a friend of Hadfield, and these are important, these are relationships. Hadfield sees him as a friend, and he's very receptive to the gospel, and there's a transformation going there, and he builds the Kinakina Church at Waikanai in 1843. And Hadfield says Kingi is one of the closest and most thoughtful Māori friends, an intelligent and vigorous leader, and an enthusiastic convert to the new faith. Now, Wiremu Kingi is important to the story of what plays out with the land wars and everything else. So we need to understand this little piece of history here. 1841, the New Zealand Company settlers start arriving in New Plymouth to establish their settlement there, and it was pretty rough ground when they got there. All the promises were not lived up to. They had to cut through the roots, and Māori looked after them. But most Māori at this stage from that area have left because they've been attacked by Waikato, and they've gone south for protection to get away from the warfare. And now the ones that are behind are watching the settlers come in, and they're starting to think, oh, this is changing, the environment's changing here. So Kingi is down in Waikanai, and he hears that Governor Grey wants to acquire more land there, and he says to Governor Grey, don't touch Waitara. That's my blanket, that's my home kainga, that's where my people come from, that's where we want to come back to one day. I've made a promise to my father on his deathbed that I will look after Waitara, because that's our blanket, that's for future generations, don't sell it. So Kingi's involved in stopping Te Rauparaha after that, the explosion of things down south. Te Rauparaha and Te Rangi Haiata are pretty upset. Everybody's trying to blame them. They've had a few infringements down there, and now Te Rauparaha is thinking about going from Otaki and attacking Wellington, and Kingi gets all his Ngāti Awa people together and says, Taiho, you're not going to do that. They block his entrance, and they preach the gospel, and they stand to protect Wellington from the invasion of Te Rauparaha. He's hopping mad. 1847, Kingi honours his deathbed promise to his dad, returns to Waitara, and Governor Grey has said, don't do it, because if you do, I will destroy your waka. I will make sure that you can't come back. And he says, well, tough. So they bring bullocks and horses and ploughing equipment. These guys know how to deal with the land. They're bringing implements and everything back to Taranaki, and they settle at Waitara. And 600 of them, 1848, to protect their ancestral lands. By this time, Governor Grey already has most of the South Island. He's been very good at acquiring land through stealth and a whole lot of means that are questionable. He has much of the lower North Island, but he's still battling for this area. He still hasn't got it. While the New Zealand Company made a promise that they would purchase it and a deal went through, it's been rejected. So Manawatu, Rangatiki and Horowhenua are some of the richest lands that haven't yet been obtained. So this is where we are. Governor Grey, meantime, appointed to South Africa, where he can cause trouble over there. His successor is Thomas Gore Brown. So 1852, Tamihana goes to England. He goes to England with William Williams, and he's granted an audience with Queen Victoria. What a privilege. So he's beginning to see, he's already watched the colonial side of life, and he's picked up a lot of the knowledge about land deals and what's going on, and he's concerned that more land has been taken than is sustainable, and he's gifted a sword and a whole lot of other things, and he comes back. And I have to say that I got invited to a house in Auckland a few years ago when I was supposed to be speaking at that church under the bridge, under the Auckland Bridge. What does it used to be? The Auckland AOG or something? I can't remember what it was, but I got invited there. But beforehand, a friend took me to this house, and I'm sitting there, and the man of the house is a big Samoan guy, and he's a prayer warrior, and he's really respectful, and you take your shoes off and all of that. And we're talking about some of these things, and his wife goes, she's a Māori woman, and she goes into the other room and she says, I've got something you might like to see. And she brings out the sword, and she gives it to me, and she said, this is the sword that Queen Victoria gave to Tamihana. She said, no, not many people know that I've got this, but this was given to me by his relatives. And I just sat there, and just the tears streamed down my face. I thought, I'm touching history. This is the sword that Tamiana Te Rauparaha was given by Queen Victoria. It's in a household in Auckland, in a place where you'd least expect it. So Kawanata Te Whitu, the Old Testament. He's impressed by the story of the kings in the Old Testament, and he's thinking, hang on, Pākehā, I've got this queen, and she's not listening to what we're saying, and our land's being taken from us. So biblically, perhaps we should have a king of our own. He wasn't the first that had thought about that, because this idea was starting to float around. Nobody's listening to us. Nobody's honouring the promises that we would be equal as British citizens. Who's going to be a voice for the Māori people? So he's referencing the Book of Kings. He's referencing the Old Testament. He's looking at Saul. He's looking at all of that. Even though that wasn't the best biblical idea, this was a model he could see that might work. So he comes back, and he and his cousin Te Whiwhi, Matani Te Whiwhi, investigate candidates. And most of the chiefs around the country say, well, we just can't do it because our land's gone. We don't have the resources to put on the banquets and to hold our mana. Because it's already being usurped. So what do we do? What do we do? So there's a lot of debate with a lot of people until it was eventually decided that Potato Tuwhiowhiru would be the first Māori king. And that was brokered by our old friend Tamihana Te Waharoa, the Christian who had built the Peria. This guy is just an extraordinary ambassador for Christ. He's the one who becomes the kingmaker, the Ngāti Haua chief who said, I'm not going to go to war. And so 1858, the first Māori king called his people to hold fast to love, to the law, and to faith in God. And the king movement gets organised really quickly. They have their own flags, laws, runanga or committees all around the countries, or a good part of the country, have their own magistrate, police force, surveyor, newspaper, and Tamihana's Bible is used to crown the kings. You know, you are now crowned the king or the queen, sorry, and it's still, that Bible is still used today to crown Māori royalty. It's a real treasure. So we need to know that. So land greed destroys relationships, or greed destroys just about any relationship, doesn't it? Really, what's mine's mine, regardless. So Kingi builds, when he gets back, he builds 3 pā at Waitara, including a whare karakia, or a house of prayer, in which he holds his New Testaments. This guy's a Christian. Treasures are the New Testament. His people are largely believers. There's a whole Christian conversion going on there, and they serve the people of New Plymouth. They supply goods and labour and fruit and veggies and pigs and all the rest of it. They're doing the right thing. They're trying to keep relationships on the up and up. But the pressure to sell land increases, and Governor Gore Brown and Donald Maclean and Paris, his land purchasing partner, scheme to acquire land any way they can. Instead of customary ownership, they're trying to get in there and break it up and say, will you as an individual sell me that land, which is the breaking of Māori tikanga, the way of doing things. So Kingi declines, and he's writing to Hadfield. He's saying, this pressure's being put on here, and Hadfield keeps encouraging him. So there's this kind of relationship going on. And eventually, in 1859, Governor Brown accepts a private offer from Te Tara. Curiously, Te Tara owes £200 to Paris, which he's borrowed from him, and it seems a convenient amount to settle for. And he's also has a grief with Kingi because Kingi protected a woman that Te Tara wanted to marry at one stage, and kept her within inside his past. So there's a grievance playing out here, and these guys, Governor Brown and Paris, know very well what's going on, and they accept the offer for £200, breaking Kingi's customary rights at Waitara. So missionaries around the country and Māori around the country through the Kumaravine, or however they're communicating, they're watching this with interest, because they're saying this is not going to go well. You break Kingi's customary rights as chief over that land. He doesn't own it, but the way to do it is you do it through the chief, and they all agree together if something's going to be sold. And Kingi's made it clear that he doesn't want to sell, and somebody who's an outsider has now, a deal's been done here. So the Crown buys 600 acres at Peka Peka, north of the Waitara River, And Kingi sends the old people out to pull up the surveyor's pegs. And that act is seen as a breaking, that triggers. See, these guys are sneaky. They've already got, Gore Brown has already got a certificate of martial law written up, waiting for the moment to declare martial law. In other words, the military takes over. He's got it all sorted up. He's got the battleships waiting. He's got the troops waiting. And the very fact that those old people pulled up the surveyor's pegs is seen as a trigger. So they go in and somebody accidentally, one of the surveyors accidentally fires a shot. So it was the surveyors that fired the shot, and now Māori are being accused of aggression, and now this law comes into place, and this is the trick. What did I just do then? Oh, that's interesting. We didn't go there, we did that. Here we go. So this is the beginning of what I call the wound in the side of the nation. Martial law is declared before Māori fire a shot. They bombard Kingi's village. And then just up the coast, Te Whiti and Tohu, who have had missionaries with them, and they've been supplying the village of New Plymouth as well with pigs and flour. They've got flour mills and everything like that, but they're now flying the King's flag because they're saying this has got to stop. Too much of our land is being forced off us, and if we're not careful, there'll be nothing left for us. So they're standing with the king who's saying, actually, Taiho, you're not listening to us. We need to create some space here and have a conversation about what's happening in this country before you continue to come in and undermine us through all your trickery of acquiring land and getting people to sign for things that they have no legal right to. So the very fact that they were flying the King's flag, in comes the warship with a big military gun on board and bombards Waria, which is Te Whiti and Tohu's village, completely destroying it after they've destroyed Kingi's village as well, including his wharikarakia full of New Testaments. So Tamihana Te Waharoa, now he's the kingmaker and he's the Christian and he's the great ambassador. He says this: Wiremu Kingi was a man of calm thought. He was misjudged. And in rushing in madly to fight with him, the government made a mockery of claims the country and people were one. The place of worship was burned, and a box containing testaments. All was consumed in the fire. The cattle were eaten by the soldiers. 100 horses sold by auction by the soldiers. It was this that disquieted the heart of William King, his church being burnt with fire. Meanwhile, King movement, Tamiana, Matani Te Whiwhi, instrumental in establishing what became the King movement, supportive of its principles, supportive of the idea that there needs to be a voice for Māori to have in the midst of all this chaos that is ignoring their concerns and dispossessing this people from the lands that they were promised that they would have for as long as they wanted to, and that they would be treated equal as British citizens. These promises are clearly not being honoured, and now the military is being called in. Now Tamiana and Matani Te Whiwhi and Otaki and Wellington and Waikanai are going, hang on a minute, we need to be really careful that the aggressions that are starting to take place in Taranaki and could spill over into the Waikato, the way that things are shaping, doesn't happen in our area. So they declared a peace zone here. We don't want the King movement here. We don't want any aggression. We don't want to provoke the government. We don't want to provoke other tribes to come in and attack us. So they're now talking regularly, having meetings, saying we need to keep the peace. We need to keep the peace. Hadfield's holding meetings. He's saying, let's not fly the King's flag, because there are people in this area now who've come back with a flag from the Māori King wanting to raise it in Otaki and in other places, and Wairarapa, the same thing's happening. There's this turmoil is happening all over the country. People are saying, actually, maybe the Māori King is the best way for us to deal with our grievances. Here's his flag, but Hadfield is holding the ground along with Tamihana and Te Whiwhi. So 1860, Tamihana temporarily stops the King's flag flying in Otaki. He goes to Papawai in Masterton to oppose the King's influence there. He wants Māori and Pākehā to live in peace, health and goodwill, but the pressure is increasing. While the war's going on, the pressure is increasing to sell here. Manawatu Rangatiki block, Horowhenua, still not sold. Various tribes saying we have the right to sell. They're at odds with each other. There's huge tension around the place. This has the potential to escalate into another Waitara. So Governor Gore Brown eventually is sacked for provoking Māori in Taranaki. Hadfield had been waging a campaign in England and amongst his missionary friends, claiming that Britain was involved in another one of its silly little wars. And he kept writing letters and he kept keeping in touch with Kingi and trying to keep the peace. Meanwhile, Governor Grey returns to New Zealand, returns here from South Africa, and the first thing he does is he claims to set up self-government for Māori. So they get an idea that perhaps there are some runanga, but it's really a contention against what the king's doing. He's pretending that he's putting in place an opportunity for Māori to have a voice in their own affairs, and that these discussions are going on around the country. But at the same time, Governor Grey has his own strategy. He's building the Great South Road into Waikato, claiming that this is just for moving goods, but in fact he has a plan. He wants that land no matter what. The pressure is on him. So really the ultimatum happens, and Gore Brown had made this ultimatum at the Kohimarama gathering. He said, unless you agree with the king, you will lose your rights as British citizens. What? Who gave him the right to say that? Number one, this really upset Māori. Tamiana and Matini were at that meeting, and they kept arguing for a more Christian approach to things, and they agreed that they would have, that they'd love to have the self-government, some voice in their own affairs. But again, I call it the Kohimarama conspiracy. It was a deflection. It wasn't what was intended at all. He'd overstepped his mark, and that's why Grey's back, but he doesn't do much better at all. So 1863, 12th of July, one day after an ultimatum has been issued to all Māori living north of Naruawahia, the line there. If you're living north of that, you have to swear allegiance to the Queen. If not, you're going to be called rebels. They've been passing legislation in the background to make sure that they can enact all of this. Then you need to get back into Taranaki. So given Māori on the outskirts of Auckland no option. They will either go and join their relatives or they swear allegiance to the Queen. They didn't see any difference between the two. And Kingitanga had made it clear that the King movement was never intended to undermine the Queen. It was simply a voice for Māori to work alongside. So there was this great betrayal that's about to be perpetrated. One day after the ultimatum, the Kingites are declared rebels, and up to 15,000 soldiers invade 3,000 Māori in Waikato. So shortly thereafter, the New Zealand Settlements Act is put through place, and 1.4 million hectares of Taranaki, Waikato and Tauranga is confiscated. 1847 to 1864, the Crown controls much of the North Island, all of the South Island, and now the big cry is, and this always upset me deeply, I always thought reserves or reservations were for American Indians, and then I discovered no, that was what the percentage of land that was 10% often put aside for every sale for Māori when they sold large blocks of land, and now Māori are having to argue to even get the 10%, and as my friend Whittemere said, it's probably 2% that they ended up with, and the money settlement often took far longer than was intended. And so where are all the hospitals and schools that were promised? So there's a big con job has been gone on. I really like that the fact that we are able to reflect on our history sometimes and go back and say we got it wrong. The New Zealand Herald came out at the time of the Troubles in Taranaki. The first issue came out, and they were, the first edition, 1863, the New Zealander of the Year would have been good Governor Grey for his peacemaking efforts, and they blamed the barbarous tribes, especially the King movement, for the Troubles. So in hindsight, in 2013, 150 years later, the New Zealand Herald gets to look at its own coverage and decide what it would have done, knowing what it knows at that particular period of time. And they say that Tamihana Te Waharoa, the Kingmaker, would have been the true peacemaker and the New Zealander of the year if they'd had a chance to look at it again. So locally, let's come back here. A lot of tribal tensions here. 1842 to 1864, the Ahura Turangi sale. It's been long debated. The New Zealand company tried to do that deal. The settlers, the surveyors came in at one point, and Te Awiawi burnt down their huts. They said, get out of here. This is not a done deal. So they went away. And so there's a long feud. Who has the right to sell to the government? Eventually it was agreed between 1866 and 69 that Rangatani, Ngāti Apa versus Ngāti Raukawa and Ngāti Kauwhata. There's this big debate going on, and eventually the deal is done and Rangatani sells that land. It becomes Palmerston North. Meantime, round about the end of all of this, Piti Te Awiawi and 100 warriors have been in Taranaki supporting the government. I understand they didn't always oppose some of those tribes, that there was some dealings going on there. It was almost like, this is a good way to get some muskets, this is a good way to build a relationship with the Crown so that future land dealings might be on a better grounding. So he's back from Taranaki with all these muskets, and they decide, because you remember this whole area has been invaded and taken over by other tribes, and some of them have pushed the areas a little bit more than might have been agreed, and Piti's saying, well, actually, we want some of that land back. And he burns a Ngāti Raukawa village and the crops at a place called Upiki, Tūwhakatupua, in the Himatangi block that had been taken in the 1830s by Ngāti Raukawa when they came down with Te Rauparaha. There's massive utu brewing. There's real tension in the air. How dare you burn our crops? How dare you kick us off our land? So they go to their friends, and there's a whole gathering in the hills behind what is today Rangiutu there, between the confluence of the Orora and Manawatu rivers, and this could be bloodshed. This could go ballistic. So what happens instead is that Hoani Meihana, remember he's an Anglican minister now, calls on his other known Anglican ministers, Henare Te Hiriko and Piniaha Te Mahawariki, and they get up there with their Bibles and they call to Christians on both sides, and they say, Taiho, let's back off a little bit. There's a few shots flying around, but nobody gets killed, and eventually peace is made, new boundary lines are agreed, a major war is averted, and Piti says, all right, we'll let the land courts sort out the rest, so now these guys can live nearby each other with an agreement like the previous agreements, that we can intermarry, we can live together, we can share the land. So boy, we got very, very close to some horrific things unfolding here that could have changed the course of the history. 1867, Meihana moves his people from Pukitotara to Orora Periti, or Orora Bridge, because there's a new road just gone in from Foxton all the way into Palmerston North through Awahuri, and access has changed. Plus, Pukitotara was very prone to flooding. Right by the river, floods would come through there, so he's moving his people. And the first thing he does is he completes a new church and meeting house in 1868, which is Te Rangi Mārie, the peace of God that passes understanding, or heavenly peace. There's no traditional Māori carvings. It's now one of the oldest meeting houses in the country. It not only marks the peace that's just been made as the tribes gathered in the hills behind that, and the Christians got together and said, let's step back from all of this, because this is going to go badly, but it also marks the earlier peacemaking by Te Whatanui. So this is a bringing together of the peacemaking deals. It marks the peace between Rangatani and Ngāti Raukawa and Ngāti Kauwhata, plus the earlier peace deals. And there were 3 greenstone mere presented out of that, and this is furthering the intermarriage, intergenerational deal. So this is like grabbing building on what has happened in the past and creating something new. We've got this marvellous meeting house out there where Wiremu lives nearby, and he's the kaitiaki with his people out there, and it's a beautiful place how that's been developed. If you haven't been out there, you need to get in touch with Wiremu and go for a guided tour, take your people out there and understand this history. So 1878, Meihana and Piti Te Awiawi asked Matini Te Whiwhi from Ngāti Raukawa to find a name for the Palmerston North Square. So Te Marae o Hine, the courtyard of the Daughter of Peace, is named for the Ngāti Raukawa chieftainess Te Rongaritu, the peacemaker. She's the sister of Maniopoto. You've heard of Ngāti Maniopoto? These are huge tribal convergences and symbolic measures that actually seal not only peace but tribal relationships. This is a sanctuary for all tribes. No weapons or conflicts was allowed at Te Rongaritu's marae nor in the square in Palmerston North, although sometimes you might wonder. So we have to pray for peace in the square. We have to pray that that name represents actually a God space. Let's reclaim that place in the square as a God space, representing the great hope that people of all tribes and races can live together in lasting peace and love. So there is, I caught a school teacher there talking to his kids, so it's an honoured place. And I heard a story the other day about Newman, Wirumu's daughter, Wiramu and Triest's daughter. There's a whole lot of street kids there, and she saw that there was going to be trouble, and she just did a waiata. She did a waiata that just changed the atmosphere, and they all sat down and took respect. I think there's a way. There's a way forward. We Māori who have the mana in a place can begin to change the atmosphere and build respect. We can't tell those young kids what to do, but if the right people step in at the right time, the atmosphere changes. I don't know. Let's not go there. I mean, I need to get, well, the three greenstone, Manawaraoa for the early truce with Rangatani and Ngāti Raukawa actually went to be with the Māori king. So there's a relationship there between kingitanga as well. Tane Nuiarangi is on loan to the Manawatu Museum. Was it stolen, Wiramu? It's stolen. God, may it come back. The other one's with the Jury family, Te Rohi o Tu Whakatupua, which is the original name of the wider area. So, Lord, we pray that greenstone might return to complete that it would bring peace when it comes, and it will be part of something extraordinary. So the greenstone is the punamu is often exchanged as a peace gift to close the warring between different tribes, and it's been used all around the country, and it's something that's a wonderful te tātou punamu, the gateway of the greenstone of peace. There's a whole wonderful story that can be unpacked with that, but I don't want to get caught up in that. So we've come through a period where Māori become very disheartened. Their land has been taken from them. They had the gospel. It looked like peace had come, and then the military come in, and now they've been dispossessed of so much of their land. And it seems that all that the government wants is more land and to tie them up in all sorts of complications. And the missionaries who have served Māori in the middle of the island have been told that it's unsafe. They need to go back and minister to the Pākehā churches. Now, your mission to Māori is over. But a lot of those missionaries who had come, including Māori who were missionaries themselves, said, no way, we're here for Māori. That's why we came. That's what we want to honour. And a number of people did that. So the mission still continues, but there's a great disruption here. And we need to remember that the first churches and sermons were Māori, in Te Reo Māori, and the first churches were Māori churches, and this is our heritage. But so often there was a failure to ordain enough Māori ministers. They did the work, but they didn't get the putia. They didn't get the korowai that honoured their mana for what they were doing amongst their own people. They weren't recognised with a collar. They weren't given the robes. That was still given to Bishop Selwyn's, kept importing English ministers to come in and kind of take over. And I think a lot of people were going, well, hang on, we were here before you. How come you ignored us? And so Māori have been sidelined. It's so often the case throughout the Pacific, the failure to recognise the chiefs and the hierarchy within the tribe and honour people and to minister to their own people as Māori were doing in the most successful period of mission engagement in New Zealand has now been colonised, except for a few areas. So the Darwin's, origin of the species is also kicking in too. So a lot of Pākehā, particularly those who are in positions of power or in the media, are taking this as an affirmation of their own mana, and they're thinking that Māori are lower down the evolutionary scale. So there's this racism all over the place, this superiority amongst certain people that really crept in about this awful time as things were falling apart. So Māori mission was kind of sidelined for about 20 years. And the rise, what came was that the Māori prophets, and if you look at all of these Māori prophets, they had all trained under the missionaries. They all had a good biblical knowledge. They all were passionate for their own people, but not seeing a way forward. So about this time, they start to go, well, what's missing here? How come you're not taking us along on the journey with us or expecting to assimilate us into your churches? You're not hearing our heart. You're not hearing our voice. You're not hearing our spiritual need. You're not listening to our stories. You've lost that holistic view. You've turned it into a clerical kind of copy of what happened back in England, and it's done damage to us. So what happened? The rise of the Māori prophets. They all dropped their Christian names that they'd been baptized by. They emerged other things into their theology, and we've got people like Te Ua Hamani, or the Windman, which became the origin of the Hauhau, or the Paimariri movement, which Paimariri means peace and righteousness. He had a good heart, he had a good intention, but what happened is that people who gathered to him at this time were dispossessed from the land wars. People had had their land taken, had their relatives killed, and they were angry. So this becomes another, another reason for that frustration to be taken out in a terrible time in our history. So he'd been a Wesleyan, so Te Tukuwaru, a Methodist, Te Kooti, an Anglican, plus he actually, I think it was William Williams kicked Te Kooti out of church one day for being drunk. But he was also a really good trader. He learned under the Wesleyans, and for a little while he married a Catholic woman until somebody told him that probably wasn't a good idea. So he had a full understanding of the Christian thing, but then he gets wrongly blamed and sent to the Chatham Islands as being part of the Hauhau, which he never was. But there he gathers a whole bunch of people, and like an Old Testament prophet, he comes back and he wreaks vengeance until he has an epiphany, a New Testament epiphany. Maybe we'll get to that, but I think he's a very important person. And Te Whiti and Tohu had been with Remenschneider at Waria. They had learned the gospel, but boy, when you get legalistic or you start to push people, they go, well, actually, I'll go with the king. You're going to do that to me. Forget that Christian stuff. Forget the missionaries. I'll go with the king. You're just not giving me any room here. The cost of war just about plunged the country into widespread debt. So this fella, we've got him to thank for our national anthem. And one of the things he said, well, of course, he wrote the national anthem July 1876. He coined that term God's own. Thomas Bracken, May 1882, he was the Dunedin Central MP, and he backed Māori in his maiden speech, saying it was a monstrous thing and a breach of the treaty to hold Te Whiti and Tohu, because 1881, while our Governor General, who was supposed to be looking after affairs in the country, he was a Christian, and he was asking what's going on at Parihaka there. You can't invade there. Oh no, we're just building roads. But the moment he went to Fiji, which is also part of his responsibility, they attacked Parihaka, and the Parihaka people never lifted a hand. You know the story. It's a beautiful story of peace and righteousness and standing, where if one person had lifted a finger, that could have turned nasty, but they didn't, and they created a world-leading, and righteous peaceful stand. But they still smashed their village, etc. And here's Thomas Bracken saying it's a monstrous thing. What they did was to hold Te Whiti and Tohu in the South Island without trial. And Governor and Minister John Bryce, again a native minister and also the minister in charge of the military, again a really badly mixed up portfolio there. Are we living in a free British colony or under some petty local despot? Will the people of New Zealand allow any man, even though he hold the rank of native minister, to ride roughshod over the Constitution or suspend trial by jury if it so pleases him? So really, Thomas Bracken, another hero of the faith, really. In this Parihaka story, I mean, you can read about it, but the New Zealand Herald again, 150 years later, 1881, its headlines were Native Minister John Bryce might be the New Zealander of the year. The invasion was an entire and perfect success, a success so great that comparatively little attention is now directed to Parihaka. In fact, they renamed Parihaka for a while after one of the invading officers and they called it Newell. Some maps have Pariaka called Newell on the map. But it's not what happened, is it? We remember Pariaka in hindsight, 2013, Te Whiti and Tohu's world-leading peaceful activism in the face of events that could easily have restarted the land wars would have been honoured by the New Zealand Herald if it had its way to rethink what it wrote in its headlines. I think they made heroes of the wrong people, should have been Hadfield instead of Wakefield, Wiremu Kingi instead of Gore Brown, and of course honouring Te Whiti and Tohu. So a foundation of love. Everywhere we go, Māori so patient, so resilient, so determined that this bad situation would be turned into something good. Pietiti Awe Awe calls for greater Māori unity. 1883, he hosted Tawhiao, the first Māori, or the second Māori king, on his first visit to Manawatu, and he urged Rangatani, keep the lands, retain your identity. On his deathbed, words were, I have laid the foundation of love for you to build upon. In 1905, his sister Irene had a marble statue commissioned honouring his loyalty to the crown and his friendship with settlers. And in 1910, Orua Bridge, Orua Piriti, was named Rangiotu for Hoani Mehana. And you know that, that picture in the square. You've got so many signs of wonderful history and promises in the square in Palmerston North of what has been, and hopefully they point to what will be if we hang on tightly to those. So the Kingmaker, Māori humbly, it's sort of voice and justice for the land confiscations, and most approaches, letters, long letters and petitions that were sent to England, that were sent to Parliament, were either delayed or dismissed. 1877, Judge Prendergast declares the Treaty of Waitangi a nullity. A silly primitive barbarians didn't have the capacity to sign such a treaty. What a horrific thing to have said, and there's a whole court case around that. Tamiana Te Waharoa we know about, the peaceful kingmaker. He lost all of his land during the land wars, but he kept his faith. He is just an incredible, humble ambassador. He kept his faith, and he prophesied his own death on Christmas Day, 1866, with that Bible in his hand. And he said to his two sons, who will succeed me? One of them said, I will get revenge on Pākehā for what they have done to you. I'm so upset about that. But his other son, Tupu Taingakawa Te Waharoa, said, I will follow in your footsteps. I will keep peace. So he takes up the kingmaker's role, and he starts a treaty petition to have the Treaty of Waitangi restored to its original promises and tabled in the Houses of Parliament. In 1914, he goes with King Te Rata to England, but unfortunately, bad timing. The First World War is about to break out, and he's told, go back and deal with it with your own government, which is what every petition to England has come back and said, go and sort it out with your own government. It's not our business. So that's a bit sad. So we've got lots of unfinished business. Miririkiriki, predicted by Tohanga and Kawa Tikiri from Rangatiki. He was a prophet and a carver, and he predicted that the person who would take over his mantle would, on entering a particular building that had been built for the visit of Te Kōti, find that the hanika tree cross on the top of the building would fall on that person. Whoever that was would take up his prophetic mantle, and that was Miririkiriki, who was a granddaughter of Mata Te Panao of Ngāti Rangitipaia, which is the tribe that is at Rangiotu. So there's this wonderful link, and she is also the nephew of T.W. Ratana of Taupotiki Wiremu Ratana, was raised by his grandfather, and all of these connections come together. There's a beautiful set of connections there that give us a godly link, but down the line to somebody who would come and help restore Māori. 8th of November 1980, Ratana has a visitation. A cloud comes toward him as he's standing on the front deck of his farmhouse at what we call Ratana Power today and enveloped him, and he was given this vision, he was given these words, he was given a commission to unite the Māori people under Ihoa o Numano, or Jehovah of the multitudes, to turn them away from the old gods and superstitions that were minimizing their ability to grow as a people and to make a success of themselves, because they were caught up in all of these superstitions, and heal the people. And he saw two whales come together at Whangaihu. That one came forward and then another one came. It's just a miracle. He saw that as a calling to be a fisher of men, like Christ had called his disciples. There's a whole story there. One of those whales provided enough oil to light the lanterns for the gatherings that were about to happen over the weeks ahead, when the Holy Spirit moved and people were healed without him even touching them. And they ended up with, it's an incredible story. 1924 Ratana and Tupu Te Waharoa, because Tupu came in 1920 to hear Ratana, and he said to him, we need to sort out the treaty. And Ratana said, not until you sort out yourself with the Bible, not until you understand that that's God first. Do that, and then we'll do the other. So the two of them have gone around the country and collected signatures from two-thirds of all Māori, asking for the Treaty of Waitangi to be tabled in the Houses of Parliament. And they're gathering evidence. They've got over 40,000 signatures. And he goes to London. He gets rejected over there. He prophesies over Japan and said, there's a fire coming from you. Unless the emperor decides not to call himself a god, there's judgment coming. Man, this guy is a fiery prophet. So much happens to him. He's just so on point with so many things. November 1932, Ratana helps to restore the Treaty of Waitangi, because Eruera Tirakatani is the first Ratana independent MP in Parliament, and in his maiden speech he talks about all the intentions and eventually tables the treaty. Over here, those are all the signatures in those books, the signatures that they gathered to take to Parliament in 1932. And why? To preserve the ties of brotherhood between Pākehā and Māori for all time. There's no undergirding, insidious, selfish intent that is for the nation, that is for two peoples together. The spotting of those signatures, it took 14 years for that treaty to be processed, and we're still working it out today. My wife's wonderful artwork, Ratana, everywhere we went round the country would say, are you united yet? You want to take us beyond tribalism and denominationalism. Everybody was welcome. So 100 years ago, in Tāmaki Makaurau, he said, here in my right hand I hold a Bible, and in my left hand I hold Te Tiriti o Waitangi. I say, first of all, let us unite under Ihoa and the Bible, and after this we will take hold of the Treaty of Waitangi. So my old dad, who died at 93 about 3 years ago, said to me one day, he said, there's too many people walking around with the treaty in one hand and nothing in the other. Thank you. So question time. Anybody got any thoughts, ideas, challenges? That word intruder.
Those lovely little pictures from Hatfield.
Should have been Tamihana Te Waharoa.
You're doing exceptionally well. What's that?
Is he going to reach them to get the last instruction book?
I'd love for that to happen because I've had so many requests for it. The first Ratana Revisited, they were going to, Penguin was going to pulp it. Because they, having them on the bookshelves it's a cost to them. So there was a certain point they said, we're just letting you know. And I went, no. So I saved up as much money as I could and bought the remainder. They sold in the shops for, they were going for $76 because it was a big book. It was a big book. I ended up selling them for 120 and they've all gone. And now if you go to the libraries, they're in that cabinet that says you can't. So it was like a misunderstanding of history. You expect history books to sell like, the latest fantasy novel or something. And Ratana the Prophet, the same thing. And I had to borrow some money to get that from being pulped. And the last of those went about a year ago. And then I asked for the rights to be returned. So I now have the rights to do something. And I would love to, but it's, you need the right relationship and arrangement to do that. And I'd need to do a bit of work. But no, it's not available right now.
Another question.
The trick in the Bible is if you get it from
The name Bible and Treaty. Yeah, well, it wasn't only Ratana, because one of the things that Ratana did when he was in Masterton in 1926, he said some interesting things. We might get to talk about some of them in the next session, but I do want to remain open for questions, and I don't want to take that time. But he did say something at the monument to Patangaroa at Te Ori Ori Marae, when he was addressing the people about how Christianity had been corrupted by intermixing it with witchcraft. He said, all the prophecies that spoke about this nation are now in my hand. I thought, what? But he's being metaphoric again. He's saying, you've forgotten all of the different things that were said by all the different Māori prophets over the time. I'm reminding you that we have had Māori prophets and they have said a whole bunch of stuff, and I'm going to be custodian of that. And amongst that, he talked about, I can't remember some of the names, but about 4 of them said that there's one who is coming who will have the Bible in one hand and the treaty in the other. So it was almost like this was a way of balancing. This is kind of an utu, I suppose. It's like what happened to the Bible promises? What happened to the treaty promises? Well, there'll come a time when it will be balanced out. And I just thought, well, that makes sense. So that's why I chose that. Yes, Ratana said that, and that's why I used that. Because I started off writing about Ratana. This was my introduction to a history that I knew very little of. I was very ignorant, and maybe a lot of us are. But I thought at one point, I'm a journalist. That's my career. I'm a Christian. And I hear things like the missionaries came to soften up the Māori in order to take the land out from underneath them. And I go, oh, that hurts. That's like those memes that flash about the place, isn't it? And we're quite lazy in unpacking some of these things. And I thought, was that true? So that began my journey. Was the stuff that people so easily, like John was saying earlier on, where did that come from? Where did that thought that Ratana was a cultist, or that he went off the tracks, or where did this come from? So I thought that's when I went on my journey to try and discover for myself the Ratana story. And then after the Ratana story, it was like, okay, what's the basis of the missionary and Māori story? So that's just now so embedded in me that I can't let it go, because I think we're late to the game. We're late to the story, and already the story is about to be stripped away from us by academics who have different ideas about the missionaries' impact on Māori culture and all the rest of it. We've got to reclaim that. And we'll talk about that in the next session a little bit more. One of the problems, of course, is that the church has not been open to embracing Māori and has often forced a lot of Māori to go, well, if you won't hear my heart, if you won't hear my prophetic skills, if you won't hear what I have to say and what my revelations are, I'll go back to the old ways. I'll go back to the old gods. I'll go back to the old stories, and they will excel because we made no room. We made no space for that to breathe. And so that's what I feel we're at a critical time where we need to reclaim the God space alongside Māori as treaty partners and alongside our Pacifica friends. How can we do this together? Because the future is going to be so complex and coming at us so fast that it's going to take future historians to understand what we're in the midst of right now, technologically, politically, every other way. If we don't reclaim our stories now, we'll lose them.
Years to try to understand why the treaty ceased to be observed and who was responsible for that. Who sheeted it home very strongly was Governor Gray. The later role of Donald McLean.
Donald McLean, the chief land purchase agent who moved to Hawke's Bay and set up big estate at Marae Kākaho and became the local, all of that. What are we asking?
After the suppression of Maori rights, land rights.
The trouble is some of these guys who have a high profile, that at times they seem to be alongside Māori. At times they seem to be standing with, and at other times they seem to be stabbing them in the back. So it's very hard to have that clear role. But maybe the worst kind of betrayal is when you get alongside and you make your friends and then you stab in the back. I'm sure that each of those gentlemen has a redeeming attributes, but as far as I can see, McLean and some of his ilk, they may have regretted it later on, but they were complicit in what Governor Gray declared. They actually were, because there was a competition between some of them. The other land buying agents were in competition with McLean because he had it down to a fine art. And if it wasn't, yes, of course, and why don't you take it to the court, and why don't you employ this lawyer, and why don't you build some fences over there, and then, then take it to the land court, and all of these legal machinations often meant Māori were camped outside the land court for months on end to sort out the differences that were going on, and that would create a debt which could only be resolved by giving up the land. So some of those, no, I don't think he comes out very, very shiny at all. Governor Gray, Gore Brown, certainly. I think later we've tried to cover it over, but I don't know. When you get Prendergast, the chief judge, saying that the treaty is a nullity, then we're going backwards and forwards. And like you say, the treaty was just not a consideration. We don't care about the treaty. We're just going to do this. And it was Ratana that brought the treaty back into focus for our present, I think, world-leading attempts at trying to restore some integrity, some mana, some justice, which is still only going to be less than 2% of what was taken from Māori, depriving them of a future and creating the kind of statistics that we face today as generational trauma. Not a lot about Eddie, but because he was the Waitangi Tribunal, he formed it, didn't he? He created that. But this is it, like Orangi Marae, over in Fielding, where I came from, where I grew up, I knew very little about what happened there, just like I knew very little about Ratana, which is up and over the hills and at the back. These are histories we should know. But out of Orangi Marae, the Ngāti Kauwhata, there's Mason Jury, Eddie Jury, these people who have hugely influenced our history. Also Rangatani. Aye. Well, this is this intermarriage, isn't it? You linked it. This is the linking together for a wonderful future, and this is all coming out now. Is that sometimes it's the humblest people who sit in the background and get on with the job that you don't recognise until later on that they actually were among the most influential, but perhaps their own marae is ignored, or their own relationship to a place like Fielding, which celebrated Colonial Day for years and years until somebody said, "Oh, excuse me, guys, you're forgetting about us." Or I pick up the history of Fielding and I go, there's 7 pages in here dedicated to anything Māori. The rest of it is Colonel Fielding, Manchester, Denby, all the names of the streets. And I just remember being appalled. And I see the museum over there now at least does a good job of honouring those early days in the swamp. Any more questions? Shall we get on with the next bit? Are you okay with this? I mean, it's a lot to take in, and it's not. You want to have? Yep, we could do that. Yep, let's do that.
Take about 15 minutes. Okay? And so the time now is, what's the time now? Start at 5 to 3. Jenny.